Prison reform. They're here to answer your questions. The lines are open right now, 0345 6060 973, and you can watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's had a frank and positive call with Donald Trump just weeks after their blazing row in the Oval Office. The White House says the end of the war with Russia has never been closer. Oz Chatterjee is a journalist in Kyiv and told LBC Ukrainians are sceptical.
There's a widespread view here in Ukraine. They don't trust Putin. They don't think Putin can be kept to his word. So any agreement that the Americans sign with the Russians is worth nothing, because time and time again, any agreement that Putin has signed, he's violated.
A teenager who was planning a mass shooting at his old primary school has been jailed for at least 49 years for murdering his family in Luton. 19-year-old Nicholas Prosper shot dead his mother and two siblings at their home in September. A man's been charged with murdering his wife, whose body was found in a car boot in East London. Pankaj Lambers accused of killing 24-year-old Harshita Brella before leaving the country. And the King's paid tribute to officers at the police service of Northern Ireland. Charles and Camilla are in Belfast for a couple of days meeting members of the local community. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed up 1 point at 87.06. The pound buys $1.29 and €1.19. LBC weather largely dry tonight with the chance of a few showers in the far north. Cloudier for southern England and a low of -5. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
A very good evening. It's 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. Let me just tell you, if you ever miss an episode of Cross Question, you can catch up on the Cross Question podcast, which is released at 11 o'clock every Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday evening. On the panel with me, sitting to my left, is Ribeiro-Addy, Labour MP for Clapham and Brixton Hill. George Freeman is sitting next to her, Conservative MP for Mid-Norfolk. To my right, Justine Greening, founder of social mobility campaign The Purpose Coalition and former Conservative Cabinet Minister. And next to her, Matthew Torbitt, political commentator and former advisor to various Labour MPs. He campaigns on homelessness and prison reform. So lots to talk about this evening. We're looking forward to your calls, text, WhatsApp messages, 0345 6060 973 and 84850 on the text, and you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Robbie in Chelmsford. Now, the last time Robbie in Chelmsford was on the programme, he tripped up Kemi Badenoch a little bit. Did you do that deliberately, Robbie?
Well, I can neither confirm nor deny, but what I can say and sure is I never miss an episode of Cross Question, and I like it so much that I've got one for your lovely panel.
Marvellous.
My question is, since Netanyahu is not responding to our government's words, is it time for further actions against the Israeli government? For example, a full embargo on arms sales, suspension of diplomatic support at the UN, or potentially sanctions on trade, and please be as specific as you can.
Right, Ribeiro-Addy, I seem to remember that you have made comments on this in the last few days, or am I deluding myself?
No, absolutely not deluding yourself.
Goodness,
I mean, Robbie, all of the above. Honestly, we've now got to a point where the situation has become so awful, and the idea that we're just going to sit by and watch this genocide continue to happen and not take any further actions, I think is wrong. There was a ceasefire. Things were going along, not in a most ideal way, of course, because aid was still a problem. But Israel has broken that ceasefire, and the international community has to take action. Otherwise more people will die.
So what would you like to see the British government do?
Well, just as Robbie has said, we need to see sanctions, we need to see arms embargoes, and we need to see, more actions at the UN, people making clear as an international community that we we don't support this. We're not going to allow this to continue to happen. Hundreds, thousands of people have died since the ceasefire has broken. And I think about all of the hundreds of thousands, that have died before that. We can't see an end in sight unless further action is taken.
So I suppose the question that begs is, why hasn't the British government gone down this line?
Honestly, I don't understand why. We hear...
I can imagine in the voting lobbies,
yes,
you sort of grabbing David Lammy's arm and saying, look, David, what on earth are you playing at?
I mean, we've made clear in the past, although it seems that we may have reneged on it, that Israel has broken international law. And on that basis alone, we should be taking further action. I genuinely can't understand why at this stage, when so many have died, when we're seeing aid being prevented from entering Gaza, and we're seeing people being kept in the most awful conditions, why we're not taking further action. It's immoral.
Do you think it's part of a wider picture, though, that the Prime Minister is on a very delicate mission with Donald Trump, particularly with regard to what happens in Ukraine? And if he went down the line that you're suggesting, that inevitably would upset, well, it would certainly upset the Israeli government, but it would also upset the American government, and therefore he feels he can't do that for that reason.
What is the cost of Palestinian lives? At the end of the day, I understand there are different things that you have to consider when taking actions as a government, but we are literally sitting here watching these people being slaughtered. We have to take action.
George Freeman.
Well, thanks, Robbie. I think why is this so hard? I think two reasons, primarily. One, the savageness of the Hamas attack and the savageness of the Israeli response. And, like two people in a pub just fighting viciously, we're all, how do we respond? And I think the truth is probably the Hamas attack was deliberately provocative, and Israel understandably have responded with the savageness that the planners of the attack thought they would, leaving us with a huge dilemma. The second point, it's really complicated because this is backed by Iran. So there's a bigger geopolitical play here, a big clash, and the poor Middle East is the playground of a big clash between ideologies. It's clear that Iran is committed to the abolition of the State of Israel and using that as a stick to beat the West and American interests. So my own view is I've always supported a two-state solution. I think the Palestinians have a very strong claim to a state, just as the Israelis did after the Jews did after the war in Israel. And what's the UK role? I think here our role is to be a moderating force within Israeli politics. There are many moderate Israelis who are appalled by what's been done. And at the moment, the hawks on the Israeli right have the upper hand.
But if that is our mission, we've singularly failed, haven't we?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think we need to be a moderating force as well with Arab opinion. Arab opinion, there are many, many moderates. I've travelled quite widely in the Middle East, and, people here, I think sometimes in the news, think the whole of the Middle East is aflame with one of two people, either sort of violent Zionists or violent jihadists, because the vast majority of people just want to live peacefully and they want to get on with their lives. And I think Britain, we're not a big military superpower, but we are a diplomatic force, and I think our role is to be a moderating force in the White House, in Israel, and in the Arab capitals. And I think that's a legitimate role that we can and should be playing.
Justine Greening.
I think, to build on what people have said, I think one of the wider challenges is the question of how Britain has influence in today's version of the world. And I spent nearly 4 years as Development Secretary, so it would have been my role to get that aid into Gaza alongside others. And that was a time when there was an international rules-based order. And the issue of breaching humanitarian law was something that was taken very seriously. I think one of the biggest challenges countries like Britain has right now is that we've entered an era where actually the big powers are less inclined to follow rules. And therefore, the sorts of steps we might have taken in the past that would have really stood out and not only had a message but had true impact on the ground are now increasingly ineffective. And so I think what's required is some thinking at our national level around what influence constitutes for us as a country today. But in the meantime, there's a longer term piece of work, which we have to get on with at some point, which is how are we going to, as countries that do support a rules-based order internationally, how are we going to build some fresh coalitions if some of the countries that we have always relied on leading them, frankly, aren't really inclined to do that anymore? And so it is about
When you say some countries, you mean America?
Yes, in essence, I think you have to recognise that, America has taken different sides. For example, on the UN Security Council, voting with Russia, which, and again, I've chaired the UN Security Council, would have been almost unthinkable. Yes, absolutely.
Amazing.
Because humanitarian law is around security, and when it doesn't get in, it has profound security issues, as we've seen. And it wasn't amazing. It was an absolute privilege to be able to do that.
You've got to do your memoirs, Justine. I want to read about this.
Well, it was an absolute privilege, but also it underlined, if you like, Britain's use of soft power in the world, and how actually that ultimately translates into a much harder power and influence. It's now a different world that we're living in. We need to work out how to be successful in this version of the world as soon as we can, and we need to hopefully do that in conjunction with key democratic allies, because if you could do it together, then it will be more powerful. But right now, we're in a time of transition, and we have to think about how we have influence today, but also what influence looks like over the coming year, 2, 3, 4 years internationally. And that, I think, is the big question, the big challenge. I listened to Tom Fletcher, who I've got a huge amount of respect for. He was one of those ambassadors I worked with when I was Defence Secretary.
Lebanon, wasn't he?
Lebanon. He's now leading the UN aid programme. It's just an absolutely brilliant, talented man. And if anyone can start to knit together coalitions on international humanitarian aid, it will be Tom Fletcher. But he has his work cut out.
Matthew Torbitt.
I think Justine's right, and I'm unsure if it can be fixed, to be honest with you, not to seem melodramatic. I think what Bella said is right. I think if there are no repercussions, why is Netanyahu ever going to stop? It seems to me until the whole population of people are wiped out, or certainly the area that they are currently populating, that small strip of land, is flattened. I think nobody would discount that Israel totally had the right to fight back and defend itself after what was an awful attack. I think proportionality has totally gone out of the window. I worry that the two-state solution is dead and nobody actually really wants it at this point in time. And I think back to just towards the end of my time in Parliament, I was really fortunate to go on a parliamentary delegation of staffers to both Israel and Palestine. We met with Israeli politicians, we've met with Palestinian politicians, advisors, academics, all manner of people. And the one thing I took away from it all is there was so much innocent life on all sides. Yeah. None of them wanted this. None of them on any side. And what it was weak leadership. And it was, let's blame the other side. It's all their fault for the predicament we may or may not have got ourselves in. And we are on a really dangerous precipice at the moment, because when Justine spoke of the rules-based order, it is the most fragile it's possibly been in decades. And, you look at America now. I think the only way the rules-based order and the natural world order has stayed as it has is because America has always stood against dictatorships. Now, I'm not calling Netanyahu a dictator, but when people do things wrong, it should be called out. And at the moment, whether it be Russia, whether it be other countries, America is no longer siding against those. They're siding with those.
Well, and let's be honest about it. It's not since Trump came to power. Biden took, the policy, okay, Trump may have hardened it a bit since he's come into power.
No, yeah.
But, Biden didn't really call anything out, did he?
I don't think he covered himself in glory. And I think maybe that speaks to the impotency we have of global leadership at the minute, of people either not knowing what to do, feeling like they can't do anything, and therefore it worries me to think about where we end up in all of this, if that's the case.
Let's take a follow-up text question from Scott in West Hampstead, who says, has Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's approach to dealing with the hostage crisis been an effective recruiting sergeant for future generations of terrorists?
Yes.
Is the state of Israel now more secure as a result of the Israeli government's actions since the 7th of October 2023, or actually a lot less secure? George?
Well, I think Scott is asking a key question. My instinct is it's less secure. If I was an Israeli citizen, I'm obviously not, I've been there, I would be very worried that Netanyahu's response, justifiable and understandable perhaps, hasn't made Israel more secure. It's united opinion in the Middle East against them.
Made his position more secure.
Exactly. So I think Scott is asking a key question. I don't think Israel is more secure. Moderate opinion in the Middle East, I think, will be inflamed by their easily portrayable overreaction. And I think inside Israel, it is the only democracy in the Middle East. It is the only place where you can be gay and not worry for yourself. It's the only place where you can enjoy the freedoms that we enjoy. And I think this is a bit of a test of Iranian democracy. Israeli democracy.
I was going to say.
Sorry. I think we know where Iranian democracy is, but I think this is also a test for Israel internally. And I think our role, therefore, is to be very clear where the boundaries of acceptable behaviour are, to Justine's point about norms. But we can't force Israel to do what it should do, I don't think, but we absolutely should make clear and support those in Israel in making the case that proportionality is key.
Anybody else on this?
I think I remember listening to, I think it was the Saudi ambassador to the UK talking about this, and he was distinguishing between, if you like, almost dealing with the current threat, like he was talking about, he likened it to a bath that was overflowing, and that it was all very well kind of making the plug hole a lot wider and dealing with the existing water, but what wasn't being focused on was the fact the tap was being turned on full by the actions that were being taken as well, and that actually you needed to look at both to really get a sense of whether you were actually having the impact that Netanyahu was saying he wanted to have. And I think even now, listening to, I think it was the Israeli government talking yesterday, saying they needed to act in part because of the risks around Hamas now recruiting a fresh wave of, people to become part of its ranks. And I think it underlines the fact that, these things aren't one-off events. They have knock-on impacts, and in terms of where this goes in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, even if you look at places where there have been civil wars and you look at levels of domestic violence perpetrated by children who were children during those times of violence, and they grow up seeing violence around them, and then that is then how they see their social norm, and so we are talking about something that will have a long-term ramification in the Middle East for the territories that have been part of this, but in particular for the children, I think, that are growing up in the midst of it, which it just does not bear thinking about the trauma that they are going through.
And I think what makes it even more disappointing is that there are world leaders that are literally watching what's happening and seeing that this continuation is all about Netanyahu maintaining power. Yeah. It's just about him staying in his position and appeasing some of the people to the right of him in his parliament. To do this, to carry out effectively the killing of so many people just so you can keep your position, and the international community is going to watch. I think that's awful, and this idea that it's going to have further ramifications in terms of future generations. Of course it is. Not just that, Israel is losing support, perhaps not from certain individuals in power, but definitely from citizens of every single country. People come out and protest in their thousands still, even after the ceasefire, because they see what's happening. And that is probably the biggest issue that they've got, that nobody is supporting this war.
Yeah, I think this has purely always been about Netanyahu's political survival. He's got his own issues in the background with regards to allegations against him. And I seem to remember a poll, I forget who it was, they polled Israeli people 3 or 4 weeks after October the 7th, and there was something astounding, like 80 or 90% of Israelis that blamed Netanyahu for the security lapse that caused October the 7th. And I remember thinking, from a strategy point of view, well, what he's got to do here really is essentially deliver, to put it bluntly, the heads of Hamas leadership on a platter and say, look, I messed up, I know you blame me, but I've put it right now and this won't happen again. But he's gone further. He's killed members of Hamas leadership, and yet this is not stopping. So I think we are not the world's policemen. However, the shadow of history will fall very kindly on the people that wish to speak out about this sort.
Okay, thank you all very much. We'll move on to another controversial subject in just a couple of moments' time. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
Terrible. 21 minutes past 8 on LBC. Our panel: Labour MP Bell Ribeiro-Addy, George Freeman, Conservative MP, Justine Greening, former Conservative MP, and Matthew Torbitt, political commentator, former advisor to various Labour MPs. Right, a WhatsApp question from Mike in Salisbury. With many parts of England now in the run-up to local elections, is the Labour backbench anger this week about the welfare reforms a sign that things won't go well for Keir Starmer on polling day? Well, it seems a long way away. Is it May the 5th, something like that? But it is looming. I think the Tories are launching their local election campaign tomorrow. Matthew, let's start with you.
I think since the election, it's not been looking good for Labour. I remember on election night being ever the optimist, saying my biggest fear was that we would see further managed decline from the Labour Party and not the real change that was promised. And it's not the usual suspects, as Number 10 would like to point out, that are up in arms about the welfare cuts this week.
Do you mean me?
I would do no such thing.
I was going to say that, and I thought, no, I won't.
I would do no. No, they like to try and paint the usual suspect. There's a lot more behind the scenes, as Bell will no doubt know as well, that aren't happy about this.
You're not alone.
And no, they're not alone. My mum rang me today. My mum, who I don't think has ever voted, she's certainly not political, but will watch the news every evening. My mum rang me today in tears, absolutely terrified that my youngest brother is going to lose his PIP entitlement. My brother is severely autistic, struggles with selective mutism, and is type 2 diabetic. He works. He will always need assistance, though. He's a cleaner, but he will always need somebody to hold his hand through it. He then texts me, terrified, having watched the news. And regardless of what comes of this, there are people up and down this country utterly terrified of what's coming down the traps. Now, I remember being one of those young activists years ago, stood outside Tory conferences saying, it's you lot doing this. And all this week has led me to do is to question what on earth I am doing in the Labour Party, because this is not a Labour Party that represents me. It doesn't represent millions of people that voted for it. It is putting things through that they do not have a mandate for. The four most unpopular decisions were not in the manifesto, whether that be the winter fuel, the inheritance tax loophole closure, now with the welfare cuts, and I've just forgotten the fourth one. Yeah, the NICs, exactly. None of that was in the manifesto, and it's actually scarily, not politically the same, but like Trump. This idea that he has a mandate for things when he's implementing things that he never mentioned during the election. So no, I think that the story of the night, Labour will be quite fortunate that it's quite a high tide mark for the Tories. So I think the story of the night will be the Lib Dems will do well. They always do locally. Reform will take a lot of places, no doubt, and we'll see a surge there. My understanding from someone I spoke to in Number 10 is they believe the by-election is dead already. That's gone. And the interesting 4D chess play is that some in Number 10 aren't against that. They're
what?
The idea, I believe...
Run that by me again?
So the idea is if you're not going to get on board with this sort of blue Labour type thing that we're doing, then this may focus some minds. And they can say, look, if you don't get on board, you're going to lose your seat to Reform as well. You either get on this bus and get involved and not be one of these...
Have they got Dominic Cummings advising them? Because nothing would surprise me.
Do you know, I will tell you off air something about Dominic Cummings in the Labour Party, and it's probably a private conversation.
Tell us all now.
Not. No. I will tell you all.
You have.
Give us a clue.
Yeah.
He's not that far away, I will say.
Didn't he have lunch with Morgan McSweeney before the election?
Other people as well, that I'm aware of.
God dear, just when you thought it couldn't get any worse.
That is a big tent.
But that's the thing. If Dominic Cummings is welcome in the Labour Party, and we have a killing off of the left, if you will, over the last 5 years.
Well, we're not dead.
Not Labour Party. No, I agree.
Well, I'll come to you in a minute, Belle. Yeah. I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say. Justine, when you look at these measures that were announced yesterday, to save £5 billion, which in a welfare budget of, £280 billion, isn't an awful lot. I think a lot of people are expecting them to be much more radical. And if you're going to burn a lot of political favour, and as Matthew's just explained, I mean, he's not happy. He's even questioning his place in the Labour Party. They could have been a lot more radical on this if they're going to sort of burn this political candle.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the numbers... it's 5 billion less of an increase than it otherwise is going to be by the end of the decade. And obviously I spend a huge amount of my time campaigning and working on social mobility, and it's impossible not to think about, in a sense, the debate is what's happened to people's lives for them to get off track, to be in this position in the first place. And I think the danger with the welfare debate is, first of all, it's impossible to kind of tease out the different constituents, the people who get welfare, because it's such a varied group. There are some that absolutely should have better pathways into work. There are others for whom, as you say, even the instability and uncertainty is actually deeply damaging for them in terms of their mental health. But I think the big thing we all miss actually in this debate is, when are we going to finally understand that lives go off track a lot earlier than the moment when people suddenly end up on the welfare bill? And actually the investment tilt needs to be upstream, whether it's in early years in education, in mentoring, in that formative period when we either get our lives on track or we don't. We know who these people, we know the communities that people are growing up in where we're most likely to get off track. I grew up in Rotherham. My dad was unemployed for a year. Like nobody's dad at school had a job. So you can kind of see where the risks are for people. And the question is, when are we, I think, collectively across the political spectrum going to be able to work out how to do the tilt to keep lives on track? When are we going to work out, as the work I do now, Iain, and you've been part of it actually, around the role that businesses play in helping lives stay on track. And the fact that that employer where your brother works actually saves the taxpayer a huge amount of money, alongside providing an opportunity for someone that gives them a real sense of purpose in their life that they otherwise wouldn't have. And we need to knit this together, and the sooner we can do it, the better. And what I've learned over the last 5 years is we do know how to do this. There are employers who know how to do this. I think we've got policy that we know how to do this. The question is, can we knit this together and make it happen? Because that's what people want, and we need to get out of this almost death loop discussion on welfare that is almost impossible to solve. We've got to solve the root causes of it, I think.
But do you think the governments that you were a cabinet minister in dropped the ball on this subject?
I think all governments have their... So we introduced universal credit, and I think, again, it was an attempt. I listened to, a lot of the language today, and it could have been the speeches that were done when universal credit was being launched. And I think whether you're from the left or the right, blue team or red team, there's got to be a bit of self-awareness about why is it so hard to shift the welfare system. And my answer to that is the fact that lives have gone off track a hell of a lot earlier in people's lives than that. And so you need to look upstream and start more effectively investing to keep lives on track. And frankly, Iain, we've got this mammoth welfare budget that's absolutely grown. And if you're me and I was Education Secretary, I was coming in on the tube today just thinking, if you just tilted a bit of that into education, you'd already be saving the money.
OK, I want to come to Belle.
Well, obviously, people are furious. People are worried even more so. And I think the worst thing is, in the end, it's not going to save money. It's going to shift people into other services. At the end of the day, if they're working and that work makes that, or you're forcing them to work and that work makes them sick, they're going to move on to the NHS. It really doesn't make sense. And even the good parts, or the parts that may have seemed good, for example, Help to Try, making that seem good. It doesn't work unless disabled people trust you, and they're not going to trust you having heard what's gone on for the past couple of weeks. And you're absolutely right. I was hearing from Scope today that course their helpline have gone up 200% because people are so afraid. And some of what we're hearing is it's very clearly putting the burden, and it all seems to be about saving money, which again, I said, we're not going to save in the long run, seems to be putting the burden on some of the most vulnerable. We know that there are issues with our welfare system. Absolutely. We do need to look at fixing them. But I don't see how now cuts and putting the burden on people in this way, trying to force them into work when they may not be able to, is going to change anything. It's actually going to make people's lives more difficult. And you've already got, I think it was something like 77% of people who are disabled and on these benefits have already gone without some essentials this year. They are the poorest in our society. They are already struggling hugely.
Matthew said he questions his place in the Labour Party. Do you?
I don't question my place in the Labour Party because I stand on the principles that the Labour Party was founded on. And I
do you think Keir Starmer does?
I don't think this policy speaks to the principles that the Labour Party was founded on. I am extremely upset about them. We are, and many, many people are, and I understand why people are angry. And
there will be a vote on this, won't there? So are you going to vote against?
I would have to vote against it. But even at this late stage, there's always time to change things. People voted for a Labour government because they wanted one that was more compassionate than the Conservative government that we had for the past 14 years, which, essentially went down this same road of austerity and hundreds of thousands of people died. We need to be better than that. We were made to be better than that.
I don't know if you saw the interview that the Welfare Minister, Torsten Bell, did with Victoria Derbyshire last night on Newsnight.
I saw some clips.
I watched that, and I was thinking to myself, if he had been a Tory minister with that unempathetic, robotic attitude...
Smug, technocratic.
I didn't say that, George, you did. People would have been up in arms, and yet it's a Labour minister, somebody who's an expert on the welfare system, having been director of the Resolution Foundation, and yet can't explain his own policies.
Well, I woke up this morning and somebody sent a WhatsApp message that said, Bell said, da-da-da-da-da, and I was like, no, it wasn't me, and then I realised, obviously, they were talking about
Hannah Cover.
Yeah.
Can you put an E on the end of your name?
No, because it's actually short for
George,
something else.
very quickly, if you can, because we're
I think the Torsten Bell clip is going to become the kind of, je ne regrette rien clip of this moment. Look, Mike's question was on the polling impact, and I think Matthew and Bell have made a really powerful case of how difficult this is for the Labour movement. I have to say, in my constituency, I think there's a lot of public support for the importance of tackling welfare, but I don't think it's going to translate into support for the government because they're really reeling from massive tax attack, jobs tax, recession, immigration still not being tackled, and this is a government that in the autumn announced £700 billion of extra borrowing, taxing and spending. So this feels like attacking clumsily the most vulnerable people for a very small saving. And to be fair to Justine, if you go back to the coalition, the Conservative-led coalition took... what was the number? It was substantial, 12 billion savings in the 5 years out of welfare through some quite difficult reforms. But universal credit in my constituency was transformational. The job centre had been like a battleground, and it now looks like a departure lounge at Stansted. It's all about getting people into work. But the key is that government was creating jobs, 800 jobs a day, 3.5 million jobs in 5 years. But in my patch in Norfolk, there are no jobs being created. In fact, there's redundancies, which makes welfare reform really hard. So I fear this is going to backfire, not just because I think in the Labour Party, and I totally respect the arguments that have been made, but I think moderate voters who in principle might think, welfare is a bit out of control, we need to tackle it, are being hammered as well. And I think they're going to conclude this government really hasn't got a plan to get people into work.
There are other ways to make money. There are millionaires actually asking to be taxed. We could have a wealth tax.
Well, my colleague Tom Swarbrick had a caller yesterday who takes home £6,000 a month after tax, and he is on PIP and gets another £400 from the taxpayer. Now, to my mind, I can see why they don't means test PIP, but that is clearly crass. If you want to save money, it's surely people like that you save the money from.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm glad I'm not in charge of welfare reform. It's 8:34 on LBC. Let's get the news headlines from Daryl Jackson.
Volodymyr Zelensky says he believes lasting peace can be achieved this year with the support of the US following a call with President Trump. The White House says it suggested that America could take ownership of Ukrainian power plants to ensure their security. A teenager who a judge says intended to unleash disaster on Luton has been jailed for at least 49 years. 19-year-old Nicholas Prosper murdered his mother, brother and sister and was also plotting a school shooting. And a man's escaped from a prison van on a motorway on the way to court. Police say 33-year-old Jamie Cooper left the vehicle, which was carrying prisoners, to Lancaster Magistrates Court near Junction 2 of the M55. LBC weather, a largely dry night with a chance of showers in the far north, cloudier for southern England and a low of -5.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:37 on LBC. Labour MP Bell Ribeiro-Addy is with us. George Freeman from the Conservatives. Justine Greening, founder of the social mobility campaign The Purpose Coalition. And Matthew Torbitt, political commentator and a campaigner on homelessness and prison reform. Right, here's a text question from Brian in Eastleigh. Why do young men have so few positive role models now? Now, the former England, it says here, men's football team, so I must say that, men's football team manager Sir Gareth Southgate has warned that young men are feeling isolated and are searching for direction online, ending up with them being manipulated by callous, manipulative and toxic influencers who willingly trick young men into believing that success is measured by money or dominance, never showing emotion, and that the world, including women, is against them. Justine Greening.
This might sound unfair, but where are the dads? You know, my dad was my ultimate role model. Obviously, I was his daughter, not a son, but, you know, he taught me so much of, I think, what helped me get on in life. You know, drive, hard work. He took me to sport, and I learned about teamwork. I think there's a genuine question about, in the end, it is about parenting, isn't it? A big part of the question on this. But I also recognise that in an online world, if you like, the ability to get exposed to some completely different role models who are quite beguiling has never been greater. I think if there's one thing that struck me this morning, listening to the debate and hearing the reporting about Gareth Southgate, who I think has to be an amazing role model, is we've got to understand that we've come full circle. So I've spent time focused on gender and sexism and equality for women, particularly in the workplace. We've focused on ethnicity, quite rightly. We've focused on sexuality. Now we're finally focusing on boys and men. And I think there's a common thread probably that connects all of this, which is around people who are coming from, if I can call it this, working class families. And in a sense, that start and, if you like, the advantages of some of it. I like to think my journey was part of what built me, but also it's got some disadvantages, and I think sometimes that can be around the network you've got around you and the fact that you haven't got quite so much of a network to draw on. So, for example, I've never had a mentor, even now. And certainly when I was growing up, I remember asking my mum and dad where I should go to university, and I remember my mum's in the kitchen saying, "Oh, I don't know." You know, I think there's something around that wider support network that people need, that maybe some people have as part of their bigger family and they're having conversations at dinner table, but for most people, I'm going to say, actually, they're probably not. And so we do need to think about where they're getting that advice about options, careers. You know, for me as a local MP, you know, I had a lot of, like Bell, a lot of estates in my, you know, council, social housing, you know, and part of the challenge is what are the career ladders some people are seeing on those estates where you can be really successful, and that is basically, frankly, at times selling drugs. And, you know, we were in a prison the other day talking to some of the inmates in my team, and these were people who were convicted of drug dealing. They wanted to come out, but actually they were entrepreneurs. They didn't want to go and stack shelves in Co-op when they got out and had done their time. They wanted to be able to put that drive to be successful into a legitimate business. And so I think it just tells you that we've got to be building pathways forward for people. If we're not doing that, then they're going to look to other people for advice on what a sensible pathway forward is.
Well, this is definitely another situation in which we have previously seen huge amounts of cuts in terms of youth services, in terms of provisions, in terms of all of the different things that used to have coming up when you were younger that could support you. And I take your point about parenting, but I do see at the moment how much influence online has for young people, things that are online. And we generally as a society, as much as we think that we do things in terms of equality and inclusion, I think we haven't focused enough on tackling misogyny. We really, really haven't. It's still such a huge problem, because if we had done more, I don't think you would see what we're seeing, you know, the Andrew Tates of this world, and people actually, and young men actually moving towards that. It's because we've left gaps open for people to slip back into that mindset that it's okay.
Part of the issue there was I was listening to something this morning, and somebody was talking about the proportion of male teachers in secondary schools. Now, in primary schools, it's always been the case that it's been predominantly a female profession. But in secondary schools, it's now become the same. Well, there are some secondary schools in the country where there are no male teachers at all. And therefore, if you're a 13, 14-year-old boy, you're easy prey for the likes of Andrew Tate, in a sense, because you see, and I've heard this personally from one or two people in their 20s who wanted to know my view on Andrew Tate. And I remember one of them, I'd never actually heard of him, and then I sort of did my research. And I could see how he had this appeal for certain groups of people, and it's very difficult to counter.
Yeah, and incel culture, that type, that, you know, when it gets to its most extreme, can lead to some awful violence. And the thing is, we're not checking it enough. We're not checking it enough. We're not creating situations where people aren't falling, or young men are not falling into that trap. I take your point about male teachers, but it's not even just about male role models. It's what we do as a society, what we promote as a society, what we see as wrong. There's so many things when it comes to misogyny that we are too often told to just brush off our shoulder. You know, that's just it. It's just lads. It's just that, you know, it's really, really awful that we still let these things happen and let these things be said.
George?
No, I agree with Belle and Justine. I'd add in a few things. I think sport, actually, if you look back in our history in the last 150 years, sport has been a really important part of giving particularly young men a chance of role models. And we've really, I mean, competitive sport has been hammered in our state education system, and the austerity and coalition cuts didn't help either. I mean, it's been going on for years. The worklessness conversation, we've got places where there just aren't men who have worked and gone out and provided that working role model. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there, but I also think it's quite deep economics. We've created a service economy, and not just in our deindustrialised communities, but across the country, I think there are a lot of men who feel rather marginalised, and that's to do with what we teach them and all of that. But there is a cultural...
Or do you mean emasculated?
Emasculated is a better word, yeah. But I think there's something else, which is the alt-right, the Andrew Tates, have used social media not just to sort of tackle these grievances, but to fuel them. And I've been watching adolescents, as I'm sure many of your listeners have. Matthew Said had a brilliant piece in the Sunday Times last week on this. Actually, Belle, echoing much of what you've said, that there's a modern misogyny which the Tates of this world are fueling, pouring, fuel on the flames. So I think there's a few things going on. There's some breakdown of our structures and our society, some economic marginalisation, and then people who should be helping to tackle it, fueling it. And I hope maybe we've got to a nadir, and this will be a national conversation and we'll turn the corner.
Matthew, I know you've done a lot of work in this area.
Yeah, it scares me a lot, Ian, I must admit. Like George, I watched Adolescence this week, and I think I'd actually been a little bit naive. I look at Andrew Tate and stuff like that, and you sort of go, people grow out of this sort of stuff, they'll move on. Because I did. I won't ruin the series for people that want to go and watch Adolescence, but I kept crying because I thought that kid was me at school. Not the hatred of women, but the questioning of everything. Why don't people like me? I'm ugly. Why am I like this? I think the one thing that saved me that Gareth Southgate touched on was football and role models there. Yeah. Not that my dad wasn't there. Me and my dad have never had a sort of deep conversation or anything like that. He's quite a shy bloke. But role models, as Justine touched on around dads, the Centre for Social Justice did a report which Gareth Southgate cited, in which 2.5 million boys are without dads, absent dads, and that can be dads that are dead as well. These aren't just people that always run away. But that was me. And conspiracy theories are very enticing in a very scary world. So I remember, and I've never spoken about this actually because you worry about the potential political futures and stuff. I remember questioning the world a lot and not knowing where my place was, and I'd stopped playing football at an half-decent level anyway, and I flirted with the far right a lot. I remember Tommy Robinson and people like that coming through, and they gave me an excuse and a scapegoat essentially as to why my life wasn't how I wanted it to be. And what Andrew Tate does very successfully, very articulate, is he puts women as the scapegoat, and all of a sudden this very confusing world that you watch the news and they're talking about inflation and GDP and the Middle East is in chaos, we might be going to war, is there going to be conscription, all these manner of things. There's no jobs, we're a 90% service-based economy, where's the industry's gone, what do I do? Is my pip going to go? All these sort of things that are worrying you. Well, it's all right because it's all the women. Feminism's gone too far. They want to drag you down. They hate men. They all want men dead and all this sort of stuff. And he's very good at doing it. And what worries me is there's a vacuum of leadership in this country, and I don't just mean political issues. For me, Gareth Southgate's the epitome. He is calm. He never threw his team under the bus. He took everything on himself and said, no, the buck stops with me. He was considerate. He would take his time and think of others. He would listen, and he's exactly the sort of role model we need. I worry that we don't have that for teenagers at the moment. I remember Gareth Southgate as a player. I think Roy Keane is a good one, as a bit of an hard man type as well. And I couldn't sleep after watching Adolescence, I can't lie, because I thought I've been naive as to thinking this problem's going to go away, and it's not actually. And I think we've all actually got a bit of a duty to... Do
you know what I think the skill of Andrew Tate is? I hate even using that word in relation to him. But he gets away with all the misogyny stuff because there are things that he says which actually aren't mad and evil and extreme right wing, and they are actually relevant to some of these boys' lives. Exactly. And so they listen to that, they think, well, that sounds sensible. So they then listen to all the horrible stuff and come to the conclusion that sounds sensible. Exactly. And I don't know how you counter that.
It's like poison in a parcel, isn't it? And the parcel, you go, oh yeah, he's got my grievance, he understands my... And then the poison is...
Well, you begin to believe the far-fetched stuff. I remember seeing a very early clip of Andrew Tate, and it was very anti-establishment. He said, they want us all to give up meat, but they'll eat what they want. They want us to stop flying, but they drive around in Range Rovers and get private jets. And you sort of go, yeah, most people will go, yeah, there's a hypocrisy at the top of... And then he goes off the cliff, and he went, well, you know why they want us to have electric cars? Because they want us, they want to control our cars and da-da. And so at that point, he loses a lot of people. But because there's a kernel of truth of what's said, you go, no, this is exactly why.
But that's the it. We need to tackle those particular issues. If people weren't feeling so isolated, if people weren't feeling like these young men weren't feeling like they had no place, like somebody was taking their job, even though that's not necessarily the case. If they didn't feel all of these things because society was dealing with these problems, they wouldn't find a home with the Andrew Tates of this world.
I think that's such an important point, and it comes down to people having a hope for a better life and some aspiration and understanding what the pathway is forward for them. And, I mean, especially in London,
Yeah.
You know, I represented, you represent really diverse constituencies, and it is literally like opportunity is hiding in plain sight. You know, you've got people who are walking past houses and they have no idea how the person who owns that house was in a position to own it. Mm. And so if you're seeing that every day, you literally don't know, it doesn't matter how hard you work, you can never get into that property. Mm.
And you get resentful.
That's why people feel disenfranchised. And I think I was the last generation where I could come from, where I came from, be the first person in my family to go to university, work really hard, get a good job, and then I could buy my first place, and I was on the housing ladder. Right now, the property I would be, maybe, probably not, but the max property I'd be buying would be nothing compared to that.
Trust me.
I feel extremely... it's that decoupling of effort and reward.
Yes.
That is why people are casting around why they're there.
I also think all men, I mean, everyone's got a job to bring up boys, but I think men have got a particular duty. I'm very lucky. My son and daughter have left home and they've got through.
You're lucky they've left home.
No, what I meant to... Sorry, I'm lucky. Well, yeah.
They probably think the same.
That they've come through this whole difficult time and they're well-adjusted young adults. But I think men have got a job as well to help make clear to boys there are lines and you've got to behave well.
Well, this has been such a brilliant discussion. I've gone 6 minutes over when I should go to the break. I'd love to spend actually the rest of the programme talking about it, but we do quickly need to go to a break. It's 8:51.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:54. Bell, Ribeiro-Addy, George Freeman, Justine Greening, Matthew Torbitt here taking your calls and questions. Nikki in Tunbridge Wells says, Justine Greening is the kind of Tory who made my mum vote Conservative for 60 years.
I'm not that old.
She now... Steady. She now no longer votes Tory because she declared that the party has lost its senses, lurched too far to the right and no longer accommodates One Nation Tory voters or politicians. Does the current Tory party not care about the these lost Conservatives and only want to reach out to reform defectors. Now, the Tory leader, Kemi Badenoch, has dismissed Reform's Nigel Farage as an example of politics as show business. This comes as a new poll in Scotland puts Reform above the Conservatives there, only just over a year before the Scottish Parliament elections. George Freeman, it's all your fault. Although you're a moderate Tory, aren't you? You're not a right-wing headbanger.
No, I set up the One Nation caucus, and after Brexit set up the Big Tent Foundation and Festival to try and suggest that the centre ground needed to be more bold, more radical, more inspiring if the fringe wasn't going to drive us out of town. So, look, it's a great question from Nikki. One of the reasons I stood again was because I wanted to help contribute to a renewal of conservatism and resist this. If I hadn't stood, I think Reform would probably have won my seat in blue-collar, quite left-behind, Reform-swinging Norfolk. And I feel very strongly that we should, as a Conservative Party, take this opportunity to be really honest about the things we got wrong and right, honest about what's going on in the world. It's huge changes from technology to geopolitics to society, some of the stuff we've talked about. It's a privilege to be able to reframe the challenges that we have to tackle and reset a set of values. And that's why I voted for Kemi, because I think she's a fresh face and she moves us on from the internal sort of old Etonian psychodrama of Tory leadership crises. She's a fresh, dynamic, young, fresh face.
She's further right than Justine, though, isn't she? Further right than you.
Yeah. But, I mean, that's fine. I'm proud to be a moderate centrist in a Conservative Party that needs to reunite on the right, and it needs to win votes. And on Reform, I think our strategy should be to respect the grievances. In my part of the world, there are very real grievances about feeling left behind by London, left behind by technology, but not chase Reform over the cliff of populism.
I'm just very aware of the time. We haven't got a lot of time, so if you can be as brief as possible. Matthew, let's go to you next.
Very briefly, I think Cleverly was the right choice. They should have gone with Cleverly. I think he had the correct diagnosis at Tory conference. He said it wasn't just Reform that we lost votes to. You've got Lib Dems, you've got Labour, you've got people that didn't turn out. And I think actually George Osborne at the conference this week said, I can't remember who he asked, but he said, what's your Lib Dem strategy? Because there's 60 seats you could totally go and try and win.
72. Justine?
I think the party needs to decide what it wants to stand for. Like, what's the point? I think the answer to that is the point is driving a country with equality of opportunity, and we need to be the party that's got the best offer on that's the most credible. The answers are out there. We've been talking about some of the issues today. Yeah. It's time for politics. And if you're in the Conservative Party to set forward a proper agenda on that, a kind of no-holds-barred, ambitious agenda.
Yeah.
Bill?
Well, I'm not really an expert on the Tory party or the right, so perhaps I'm not the best starts, but it sounds kind of like they've been here before. Remember, and with Nigel Farage as well. Remember when there was talk of a kind of UKIP, chasing UKIP, and now it's chasing Reform. Perhaps they just need to stop chasing Nigel.
So, I feel really strongly about this. If you boil my conservatism down, it's opportunity given for all, responsibility taken and given, and enterprise as the engine of those two. If we believe in that, we need to rebuild a shattered party around those values, be an organisation that gives opportunity and responsibility. That is very different from following Reform over the populist cliff, and that's a battle worth fighting.
And have people in it who actually have a journey to be able to contribute to what that policy agenda looks like.
Yeah, like Matthew. Come on, Matthew.
It means
come and join us, rebuild a conservative movement for opportunity.
That would be a big tent, wouldn't it? Right, let's go to our fun question from Cecily in Worcester. The model of E.T., which was used in the film, is going up for auction for around £500,000. Which one film prop would you love to have in your home the most? Justine?
Well, I was really struggling with this, and I thought, what's my favourite film? And I thought it was Mamma Mia, because I had such a great evening watching that with my mum. And then I thought, I wouldn't mind that yacht. But you've just changed the question to say, in my house. Obviously, that wouldn't fit. But I'd something out of that. I'm a mad ABBA fan. I would have had that as my mastermind subject if they'd allowed me, but they wouldn't let me. So
I've never been invited, strangely. Matthew?
Slight cop-out, and it wouldn't quite be appropriate in my house either, but one of my favourite films that used to inspire me a lot in dark times was the story of Tony Benn's life, Will and Testament, and I've been very fortunate in life through persuasion and begging, borrowing and stealing to been able to meet a lot of the people I would like to meet in life. Tony Benn is the one regret I wish I'd have met. And
Really?
I'd have loved to have had a cup of tea with him and discuss all things.
I interviewed him a few months before he died in his flat in Holland Park. And actually, it isn't the only time. It's the second time that someone has fallen asleep in the middle of being interviewed by me. Michael Foote was the other one. So draw your own conclusions. Belle, never let me interview you on your own.
Tony Benn was absolutely lovely. He was. It would have to be the wardrobe from The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe.
Oh, yes.
We just need to get out of here sometimes.
Yeah, totally
I love
agree.
that.
Can I have the model from Warhorse? It's the play, not the film. And if I'm not allowed it, can I have the Apollo 13 space module? Because it's a great movie and I could
You
spend
must have a
hours.
very big house.
Yeah.
Well, put it in the garden.
My garden's too small for that.
Well,
Lucky
we've
I've
had
got
a
garden
very
as well.
thoughtful cross question this evening, and I say that as a compliment because I think some of the subjects we've covered, we've actually had quite a deep conversation. So thank you to all of you for coming in this evening. On Monday's panel, we have the Conservative MP and former Net Zero Minister Graham Stewart, Sarah Owen from Labour, think tank director and former advisor to both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, Theo Bertram, and LBC's own political editor, Natasha Clark. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to talk about guns and ask the question, why does anyone need to own a gun? Because gun sellers are going to have to inform police before they hand over firearms in the wake of a teenage murderer's plot for the deadliest school shooting in history. Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, is to overhaul gun laws to close what she said were the deep and long-standing weaknesses in private arms sales exposed by triple killer Nicholas Prosper. I'm going to admit to you that I was 10 years old when I first had a gun licence, which will shock a lot of people. That could not happen now. I think we actually have some very tough gun laws, but do they need to be toughened up? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.